You're listening to Ingenuism's Silicon Valley Examined, where we delve into how the tech industry is helping create progress at the speed of thought. I'm Don Watkins. With me, as always, is Robert Hendershott. All right, Robert. So, welcome to the show.
Morning, Don.
So we were both watching an interesting TED Talk by Mariana Mazzucato. I think that's how you pronounce her name, who is famous for writing a book called The Entrepreneurial State. And I wanted to use her kind of way of thinking about things as a jumping off point to think about how you would tackle this kind of issue from an ingenuous perspective. So just for people who are not familiar, part of what the core of what she argues is that if we look at things like the internet or the iPhone or pharmaceuticals, that breakthroughs come from a crucial role in those breakthroughs is played by government, not merely in the sense that a lot of people and a lot of economists have argued that government funds basic research, but she thinks that the application of research, the commercialization of it, the government has been intimately involved in these and is a really crucial factor enabling us to think outside the box, so that it's not just that you need the state for a legal or physical infrastructure, but as she puts it, that the state does and should create and shape markets. And so what we would really aim for is not an antagonistic relationship where it's government versus the private sector, but this idea of public-private partnerships. And that just as you would have, venture capitalists expect to get rewarded for the risk that they take on, we want the government to get rewarded for its role in creative risk taking. Now, before we dive into kind of how you analyze it, I at least want to put up front some of my reactions to the argument. And in particular, the thing that jumped out at me is that she starts out by asking a question, which I do think is an interesting question. And we've addressed it on some of our writings, and I think in an earlier episode, which is why are there no European Googles? And what's interesting is that in the talk, she never answers that question, even though that's what she starts out posing. And my reaction is that actually poses more of a challenge to her thesis than it is her thesis being an answer to that question. Because if you think about Europe, they're much bigger on public-private partnerships. And indeed, she gives an example of how a European government does what she recommends in terms of that the government has kind of a certain equity in the projects it helps spearhead or fund or create. And so there's kind of two ideas pushing against each other. It's on the one hand, there seems to be some evidence, and certainly she makes a strong claim about the government's role in major innovations. And on the other hand, this doesn't seem to be this involvement of government and innovation and private sectors. That doesn't seem to be distinctive to the U.S. and certainly not to Silicon Valley. And so as an ingenuous, when you're thinking about what is the proper role of the state, how do you go about starting to unravel that question?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack in the entrepreneurial state, and I do think that first question of where are the European Googles, where are the European Apples, where are the European Facebooks is really important, because you have literally hundreds of millions of smart, educated, talented people, and you want to get as much progress out of that group. This is part of the elite, and historically the majority of scientific breakthroughs and discoveries came out of Europe. And so to not have Europe be as productive from an innovation sense, it's a real problem. I mean, it's a challenge. It's an issue that is costing us all. We don't know what the European Googles would look like, but we can safely say that their existence would benefit literally billions of people. And so I think that's a really important question, and it gets to the one answer is that Europe isn't doing public-private partnerships correctly. That European governments are not taking the correct role in fostering innovation, and you can make that argument. I think it's hard to actually back up with data, but it's worth evaluating. I think that focusing on government, though, is just narrowing your vision more than you need to. I mean, you could ask a lot of questions about what is behind the lack of a European Google, and a lot of the answers, wouldn't even be in the same ballpark as government. I mean, we've talked about failure. We've talked about the rewards that come from innovation, and I think that if you want to really answer the what I think is the important question is how can we start having Googles coming out of Europe, then immediately jumping to, well, what's the role of the state and how can the state do its job better, is already carving off what is potentially most of the answer.
I think that's a really important point. That is, the whole setup of the issue is we're trying to think about the goal of promoting innovation, and we're just going to start with what's the right relationship between government and the private sector. I think one of the things that we've tried to do is start with looking at innovation that actually takes place. How does it happen? What are the kinds of activities and kinds of processes that are behind it? And what are the things that kind of slow it down and stop it? And then you can build up to an answer of, well, what's the role of government? But government's just an institution. And one of the things that happens when you just start out with private versus public is that you blend a lot of distinctions between institutions, even within those two categories, right? So, for instance, we talk a lot about the difference between large bureaucratic private organizations and the impact that has on people's ability to collaborate, to test out new ideas, to remain flexible. From kind of a startup and lots of startups even, who are, testing different approaches and can be quite nimble. And at the same time, within government, there's more and less bureaucratic parts of the organization. There's some government agencies and organizations that are kind of these small, like, go out and try a bunch of stuff and see what works. Particularly you see that, in defense, there's more experimental parts of it that are not governed in the same way that, say, like Medicare is. And so if we start at the level of these big institutions, I find it really hard to figure out how you would work down to an answer of how to promote innovation versus starting with innovation and kind of working your way up to institutions.
Yeah, once you start thinking about institutions, it becomes much more of a continuum and not binary, where you have, what are purely public. We have public-private partnerships. You have regulated monopolies. You have large companies that evolve into I said devolve, and I kind of mean that, but I mean literally evolve into a bureaucracy because they have so much to lose from mistakes, all the way down to a little startup that has really nothing to lose. And you lose all of that granularity if you focus on public-private as the only characteristics. And at the same time, I think the title is both provocative and reasonable. If you are trying to support progress, and you accept that there is going to be a government, then you would want to ask the question, how can we have an entrepreneurial state? I mean, it's easy to look at the examples of, the classic would be the post office, the DMV, of where a state agency is horribly archaic. Although I have to say that even before the pandemic, particularly in the pandemic, the DMV in California started to actually provide some online services. But be that as it may, the fact that there are terrible examples of what the state does doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask the question, how can the state do things better, and under what circumstances would state involvement actually accelerate progress?
But I think that's right. But if you were going to do it, if you're going to explore that kind of question, I don't think you can do it in the way that Mazzucato does it. That is, what we get is, here's the iPhone, and the government played a role in all of these pieces. And I should say, we're not going to get into, does she get the history right and everything like that. I think she definitely oversimplifies it, but there's a really good series of kind of factual analyses of the of her on these points at a blog or website, nintil.com, that I found really interesting. I don't want to get into that, but what I will point out is that there's never a counterfactual that's run. So it's, well, if government hadn't been involved in these areas, would the progress have occurred? Might it have occurred faster? There's never any counter evidence of, okay, well, what are examples where government might have slowed down or impeded innovation? And so there's very much an approach, I think, of stacking the deck, whereas what you would really want is to get the whole lay of the land first and not leap to kind of well, here's my conclusion and here's some evidence that seems to support it.
Yeah, we're all susceptible to confirmation bias, and when you look at things at a very coarse scale, whether it's public-private or it's U.S. versus Europe, you don't get enough obvious distinction that you can really view it through whatever lens you want. And if you view it through the lens of Ingenuism, then the first thing you would want to do is look at what has been done. Like, where have you seen distinct approaches being taken, where you can contrast the approach that, say, NASA has towards developing space-going rockets versus the approach that SpaceX has. And you can look at the results, and you can look at the differences, and you can start to build data about what works and what doesn't, which is the core of Ingenuism. Is if there are a lot of different things being tried, we're going to necessarily start learning about what works and what doesn't. And if we allow a positive feedback loop where more resources go to what's working, then we'll evolve into something that, while it might not be optimal, because we never do know the true counterfactual, while it might not be optimal, it is on the path of greatest progress that we can observe. And there is some work on that. Josh Lerner wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, and it's a pretty academic book, so I don't know how highly I recommend it for reading material, but it's interesting because he really does try and take, in a particular flavor, which is basically Silicon Valley style investment, try and take a look at where things have been tried, what was tried, and how successful it was. And there are examples of pretty good success, and there are examples of clear and absolute failure, where you end up building something that never gets used. And so that's the first place that we'd want to look from an Ingenuism perspective. But really, Ingenuism is forward-looking. And what we'd want to do is start to try things based on what we know, but also based on where we could learn the fastest. And that would mean small scale. It would mean, it doesn't necessarily mean private, but you generally get small scale and more nimble responses to feedback in private companies. So you would look at what are the opportunities to learn in what's going on in private companies, not just U.S. versus Europe, but within the U.S., within Europe, around the world. And then using that, you might try and design some experiments using public agencies and say, okay, well, if we know that DARPA produced these things and it more resembles what we would consider an innovative organization for A, B, and C reasons, then we start designing, and this is already happening, DARPA-like efforts in other areas. So instead of focusing on defense, it might focus on information technology or medical technology or energy. And these are things that are currently happening in Washington, D.C., and they're simultaneously exciting and a little bit daunting, because you don't hear anything about the why will these work? What is it that we're building into the design that will make it more likely that the investments will be effective in spurring innovation and progress? And how are we going to deal with failure? Because unfortunately, the historical record is that government is either completely intolerant of failure or completely tolerant of failure. And neither of those are a productive relationship to failure. You need to be able to try things and have them fail. And you also need to be able to stop doing things that aren't working. And until you get the right blend of that, and everyone struggles for that, from venture capitalists up to Fortune 500 companies, until you get the right mix there, it's very difficult to really harness the energy of Ingenuism to learn, what's the role of state, how do we design public and private institutions to really support progress, and how do we build what might be a public-private partnership.
Well, but see, I view it a little bit differently, which is that I think the issue you raised with failure is precisely one reason why we should at least at minimum be quite skeptical of government's role. Because if we think about how does an organization find the optimal mix of tolerance versus intolerance towards failure, you have to have the profit motive guiding you, right? Because the profit motive says, yeah, I have to be willing to take risks. And the profit motive also says that I better not keep tolerating a risk too long. Whereas if you insulate a project from profit, it's not clear how you could ever make that kind of assessment.
So definitely the profit motive is a good way to build some balance of evaluation. I don't have any reason to think it's the only way. I think it is the most robust and reliable way because it depends on each individual's incentives. It doesn't require that you put in the proper governance system and that you continue to do that, or you have the right political economy. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. And the I think legitimate challenge to how we think about progress inside of a profit system, or even you see it popping up everywhere in the entrepreneurial state, is there's just not a easy way to quantify, even though we have to recognize that this exists and it's massive, but an easy way to quantify what economists call the overall surplus from these innovations. When you asked at the beginning, where are the European Googles? And I'm like, that's the question. It's not because Google's a $1.5 trillion company. That is a big deal, and that's the capitalized value of the expected future profits. Like, that gives you a good measure of the impact Google has had, but it pales compared to the impact Google has had on all of our lives. One thing I like to ask, when I was teaching this stuff, I'd ask my students or ask people who are interested, is how much would you pay if you had to pay to use all things Google? So if you were thinking about, I'd have to give up the search engine, I'd have to give up my Gmail, I'd have to give up my Google Maps, I'd have to give all that up. How much would you pay to keep that? And one way to think about it, to frame it, is to think about giving up your phone, not your smartphone device, but your phone as a device to call people. You can call anyone in the world at any time. Having a phone is really great. But most people, when push comes to shove, would give up the ability to call people on their phone before they would give up all things Google, because there are lots of other alternatives like messaging that they use just as often or are similarly powerful. But that just gives you an idea, because how much do you actually pay to have your phone? You're paying $10 a month, $20 a month, $50 a month. And so we're talking about hundreds of dollars a year that the average person would pay to use Google, and that's on billions of people. So we're talking about a number that is somewhere in the $1 trillion range of value for what people would pay to be able to use Google, which is absolutely free to them. And so when we look at the impact of not having European Googles, I don't think we can just look at the profit. We have to look at the overall, more heuristic picture of progress. Is that there's a lot of upside that's missing when we don't get this right. And having an entrepreneurial state would be a big plus, because I don't think we have one. And part of what an entrepreneurial state would have to do, just like any entity that's operating in innovation, is to make sure it didn't violate the core principles of innovation. And Ingenuism says that's connection, exploration, and a supportive environment, where we're still kind of fleshing out what exactly we think a supportive environment is. I mean, that's the really interesting question, because if you encourage exploration, you're going to get more innovation. If you create connection, you're going to get more innovation. It's going to have a bigger impact. But those two compound, they magnify each other. But this question of how do you have a supportive environment and what could the state's role be, it's really important, but it can't go back and start to balkanize the world and diminish connection, or discourage or even retard exploration, or else you're going to end up with less progress. And that's personally my biggest fear, isn't that you would have a inefficient allocation of resources because you don't have the profit motive and you're using something else that might not be as good, but that you would actually have unintended consequences that would, because the state is unlike a company, which there's more of a voluntary relationship and more alternatives. The state can make mistakes and keep doing them for a long time. The U.S. just got out of Afghanistan. If you argue it was a mistake, then you probably argue that we should have gotten out 10 or 15 years ago. But that's not typically how states operate. Now, we could design a state that responded more to feedback and could fail, what's the right way to put it, gracefully. I think that would be huge in more areas than innovation.
Well, and I think that's the really important point. I don't think you can make a case for, this is the positive role of the state without taking very seriously what the risks or downsides are. Because we certainly know from history there's plenty of downsides. So we can take the extreme examples of states like North Korea, where you basically eliminate connection, experimentation, and anything resembling a supportive environment. But even if we set that aside, we've talked about, for instance, how there's real evidence to think that government support for nuclear was as much a problem as later government opposition to nuclear. That is, they pushed ahead of technology. They pushed it in a very particular direction rather than a lot of experimentation about the best way to build reactors and so on. And that has led us to where we are today, where this incredible potential technology is vanishing more than it is progressing. And so I would want to see a real contending with the downsides and potential downsides of government encouragement of innovation. I think the focus on the innovations we've have had some amount of, government aid. I think that's nowhere near sufficient to have a real view of what it takes for government to be supportive of progress.
Yeah, if we look at history, we find these examples where progress seems to get launched and quite dramatically by a strong government initiative, and then it stagnates. It's not just nuclear, it's space. We would have seen the same thing in pharmaceuticals. And if you take that as maybe the canary in the coal mine, you would look at what were the fundamental reasons why nuclear, why travel to outer space, why these things stagnated. And then, in theory, you would get some idea about what the role of the state is, because it's not A or B. If we're looking at it from an Ingenuism perspective, You wouldn't want to say there could never be a role of the state because we just don't know. But you also would want to have some guardrails that would keep the state from making the kind of mistakes that were made in nuclear and in space. So I really agree with what you said, and I'm still really interested in, okay, well, what can we learn? Because there was a large aerospace component to early Silicon Valley. And would Silicon Valley have developed exactly the same way without that? Almost certainly not. Would it have ended up in basically the same place? Possibly. So we need to look at more than one element of successful. It's not exactly an organization, but let's call it an organization or maybe an institution. And then also look at more than one unsuccessful, and that's why I think there's been a good start, because a lot of people have tried to build Silicon Valley and no one's been quite successful, and no one tried to build Silicon Valley originally, so it happened for reasons other than there being a specific goal. But there has been a lot of success in mimicking parts of Silicon Valley. You can at least figure out what not to do. If you're going to violate what you think was important about the valley's development. But I think at a more fundamental level, if we are supporting connection, if we're supporting exploration, then we would naturally find out. We don't see a lot of that sort of, I'll call it humility. Most people have a specific answer that they have already decided, and it's become then just how do I convince people to do things my way?
Yeah, I mean, I get it, because I think these are hard questions to answer, and so there's kind of a default onto people's priors. Some of that is legitimate. Like if you have real principles that you've formed and you're bringing them to bear in this question, I think that's right. But I mean, you talked about confirmation bias, which we're obviously all at risk for. But if you just think about the complexity of the problem, so I forget exactly what you said that made me think of this, but even if we're studying what role did government play in things like you mentioned the aerospace industry and how government kind of fueled that and that unleashed progress. Well, even if we take our actual track record of innovations, there's kind of an assumption buried that was optimal, right? Whereas, well, if we had followed a different path, maybe we would have had something just way better altogether, right? It's not would we have created the same things absent government involvement and at the same pace, but what else would we have created? So it's all of these thought experiments that we can't actually run, but that would really go into assessing what is the ideal setup to promote progress. Did I make that point clear?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And I'm not at all arguing that we should take the other extreme, because I think that there's a lot of evidence that just throwing government money isn't productive, and that there are unintended consequences that can be pretty severe in chilling innovation when you introduce basically politics. At the same time, the recent infrastructure bill, I think, had $6.5 billion for an ARPA health program, ARPA-H, that I believe the NIH would handle. $6.5 billion is a lot of money, and I think that it's a totally legitimate experiment given the potential upside from breakthrough research in health. The question is, what kind of projects are going to get funded? How is the money going to get spent? And then how is the entity, we'll call it ARPA-H, how is ARPA-H going to be evaluated? in advance, you should say, okay, this is what would constitute success without it being too narrow. You wouldn't want to say, okay, if we get a cure for cancer, then good. If we don't, then bad. You might say something like, if there are 25 new companies formed out of this basic research, it's good. Or you might say anything that would give you a metric that you could go back then and apply, so that when you're trying to draw lessons, you have some sense of whether we're evaluating success or a failure. And if we leave it till the end, then we all kind of know how it will be. Whatever they did would be defined as success. And I don't see any evidence that's what's being tried. And at the same time, that if you're going to spend $6.5 billion, or maybe we should spend, I don't know, $20 billion and split it among 3 entities that are very different. One run by the NIH, one run by a consortium of universities, and one run by a consortium of venture capitalists. I don't know. I'm just making shit up. The point is that we are spending so much money on these public initiatives that both improving the entrepreneurialness of the state and learning what works could have a huge impact. If we don't do that, I would be an advocate for basically cutting it to zero, because if you don't know what you're getting for money you're spending, then you should stop spending it. That's not Ingenuism, though. Ingenuism would be to learn what works, keep exploring the different options, and be ruthless about stopping what doesn't work and building on what does.
Do you see anybody out there advocating for that in a way that you think, unlike, let's say, this case for the entrepreneurial state, that you think is actually more sensitive to the kinds of issues you're raising and is actually trying to solve this problem? Because I think if you asked anybody, even somebody like me, who's, on philosophic principle, I want the government basically to be police, military, and law courts. But if you set that to the side and just ask people, including me, well, wouldn't you want, so long as government's doing these things, shouldn't we figure out how to do them better? I think they would say yes. But is anybody really kind of pushing for a way to do that you're aware of and that you think is kind of a good model for how to think about these issues?
Not in big countries like the U.S. Or in, obviously not a country, but a union in Europe. Unfortunately, there's a link between centralization and these sort of initiatives. And I think that's the weakest part of the entrepreneurial state, is that if you can't de-link centralized control from these efforts, and that NIH has whatever track record it has, but it is a large, bureaucratic, well-defined, already has their processes entity. That sort of institution isn't where you're going to get the experimentation. Where you do, I think, see both more effort towards figuring out what works and better results are in smaller organizations or smaller entities. So you end up seeing success in these types of efforts in places like Singapore, and you don't see this success like this in larger entities, including China, who's building a modern economy, but not it's using quality and not, it's using quantity and not quality. So I think that you ask a really good question, and if we just talk about the U.S., what the place that would be the biggest lever would be to impact that question of not should we be spending $6.5 billion or $20 billion on exploring new ideas in healthcare innovation, but how are we going to spend that? And more importantly, how are we going to make sure that the next $20 billion, whether it's 10 years down the road, how are we going to make sure that that's done better? Because the place that people usually point to, it usually is related in somehow to defense. And one thing defense is really good at is spending money without particular care about the cost, but getting things done. And it's also a place where all of the work is, in an ideal world, never used. So all the weapons you develop, all the weapons you build, all the strategies you come up with, everything, in an ideal world, you don't have to use it. And that's just not the case in other areas. So it's very easy for defense to give up whatever happens inside, to give up the ARPANET. It's much harder to have the conversation of what should the NIH get out of whatever comes out of ARPA-H. And that worries me, because you already hear it in the entrepreneurial state is, well, what about the reward to the public institution? Well, the reward would be, if we cure cancer, we're all going to benefit. And that doesn't mean that there's some moral argument that there shouldn't be any public equity in the eventual companies that are curing cancer. It's just it's a complication that distracts us from the real benefit. And this, we saw this over and over in 2020, where there would be a distraction from the real goal, which would be to get a vaccine and get it into as many people as possible. How much people were going to charge for it, who was going to be making it, who was going to get it first. Those are all questions that are hard to ignore, but they are secondary compared to the actual tremendous global benefits that can come out of these discoveries.
Yeah, and I think, not to go on this too much, because I don't know that there's that much of a support for this idea, but the idea of, like, well, hey, the government helped spearhead it, it needs some financial skin in the game. Again, it's reifying government and treating it as this actor with incentives and, oh, it will work harder if it gets profits or something like that, versus, I mean, the reason that profits work in venture capital is because the individuals who are making the decisions are going to profit. But if you think about, like, the way that governments actually operate, it's not that's not an incentive system. And given that the profits wouldn't be going to the individuals involved, I don't think would be a useful incentive. I mean, the military and defense is a good example, because there you see kind of the best incentives of government, which is, like, we don't want people to kill us and kill our citizens. And so we're going to try everything we can to make sure we stay at the forefront of potential military technologies. And notice that we want to be at the cutting edge of technological capability, not of economically viable technologies, right? And that's the insensitivity to cost, right? It's I mean, this is sort of what I think the best argument that's leveled for government having some involvement in research in the end. I personally don't think it holds, but it's a strong argument, which is, you discover a lot of cool things when you're not confined by cost and aiming at cost. Yeah, you waste a lot too, right? You've developed 1,000 technologies that are expensive and don't work and can't be scaled and so on. But you're able to try things out just for the sheer engineering feat of it, because in a military context, it's not, it doesn't matter if it's uneconomic, if your opponent can just blow you out of existence with a bomb that you can't defend against. So I forget exactly where I was going with that point, but it's basically the idea that we have to really think about the actual incentives that government faces and the positives and negatives of that. And I think you can't mirror from, what the incentives are for a private company to, if we just match that in government, it'll have the same incentives, because I don't think that's true.
Well, that's something that's probably discoverable. because there's the other effect, which is nobody who's smart and ambitious and talented. I shouldn't say nobody, but not very many people of that quality are going to want to go and work at the post office, because we all know that the post, or go and work at the DMV. We all know, who goes there. So it becomes there's a certain element of self-fulfilling to that. And at the same time, I have a cousin who works at JPL and works on the Mars rover, and he's super smart and he could be doing something else and making more money, but this is something he's passionate about, and it's high status. It's really cool, not just for him personally, but for his family and even for his future career. And so there does have to be some element of it works for the right people to get into a public position or a public-private partnership. But I do think this is discoverable, because we're starting to see, and it's relatively recent, but we're starting to see more of these ARPAs, right? ARPA-H is the new NIH. We're going to take moonshots and see what comes out of it. I know there was one for energy. I think there was one for Homeland Security. And I know that they're talking about one for climate. There's all of these new entities being created to mimic DARPA and to push money out into risky but potentially high upside ventures. And given that the upside of certain things just goes way beyond what you can capture in the private context, COVID vaccines is the obvious one. The COVID vaccines is going to generate tens of billions of profits. And maybe even in the end 100 billion in profits, but it was clearly worth an order of magnitude, maybe 2 order of magnitudes more than that, versus the world of no COVID vaccines. So I'm in favor of trying these things as long as they are they're committed to learning what works and building on what works and quitting what doesn't. And that they stay inside the guardrails of Ingenuism. And what I like about the ARPA, shoveling money out the door, is that it tends to build on connection and definitely build on exploration and experimentation. So if we are going to do anything, if we are going to look for where is the entrepreneurial state, I would go, and it's full circle to where you started, I would go to these smaller efforts. And it's hard to think of $10 billion as small, but it definitely is small in the context of both what the state does and what the upside is if this were to be effective. To go to small institutions, small organizations, small amounts, learn as quickly as we can, and discover, is there a way that the state can be entrepreneurial, and is there a way that they can contribute to progress and not generally just be an anchor?
Thanks, Robert. We will not be here next week, but we will be back the week after that. Best way to stay in contact, as always, is to go to ingenuism.com and sign up for our weekly Substack newsletter. Talk in 2 weeks.